What if I told you that America fought over 40 separate wars against Native American tribes? Yet most history books call them conflicts or incidents. These weren't small skirmishes. We're talking about systematic military campaigns that lasted over 400 years, from 1609 to 1924. The U.S. Army estimates that over 45,000 Native Americans died in these wars. But independent historians suggest the number could be as high as 100,000. Yet, when you search for American wars in most textbooks, you'll find the Revolutionary War, Civil War, World Wars, but the longest-running wars in American history are barely mentioned. If you think you know American history, this video will completely change your perspective. So make sure you watch until the end. Welcome back to our historical investigations. Today, we're uncovering one of the most systematically hidden chapters in American history: the American Indian Wars. These weren't isolated conflicts, but a continuous series of wars, spanning over 3 centuries that most Americans have never heard of in detail. In this video, we'll explore how over 40 separate wars were fought against Native American nations, why the U.S. government refuses to officially recognize most of these as wars, and how the systematic erasure of this history continues today. We'll examine specific battles that were more brutal than famous Civil War engagements, military strategies that would be considered war crimes by modern standards, and government policies that legally justify genocide. Most shocking of all, we'll discover how the last of these wars officially ended in 1924, less than 100 years ago, yet most Americans believe Native American resistance ended in the 1800s. The evidence we'll uncover today reveals a pattern of historical manipulation that continues to shape American education and national identity. To understand the scope of these forgotten wars, we need to start with a timeline that most Americans have never seen. The American Indian Wars didn't begin with the famous battles of the 1800s that occasionally make it into textbooks. They started in 1609 with the Powhatan Wars in Virginia and didn't officially end until 1924 with the last Yaqui conflict in Arizona. Let me give you some specific examples that demonstrate the scale of these conflicts. The Pequot War of 1636-1638 in Connecticut involved coordinated attacks by multiple colonial militias that resulted in the near-complete destruction of the Pequot Nation. The Mystic Massacre alone killed between 400 to 700 Pequot men, women, and children in a single night. It pleased the Almighty to strike terror into them so that they fled from us and ran into the very flames. King Philip's War from 1675 to 1676 was proportionally the deadliest conflict in American history. Over 3,000 Native Americans died, along with 600 colonists. That's roughly 10% of the entire colonial population at the time. Yet most Americans have never heard of Metacom, also known as King Philip, who led a coordinated resistance across multiple tribes. The French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763 is sometimes taught in schools, but always from the perspective of European colonial rivalry. What's rarely mentioned is that this was fundamentally a war about Native American sovereignty, with different tribes choosing sides based on which European power offered the best terms for maintaining their independence. Moving into the 1800s, we have conflicts that were massive military operations but are often reduced to simple narratives. The Creek War of 1813-1814 involved over 10,000 American soldiers and resulted in the death of approximately 3,000 Creek people. Andrew Jackson's forces used tactics that included burning entire villages with civilians inside. The Seminole Wars in Florida lasted from 1816 to 1858, spanning 42 years with multiple phases. The U.S. military spent over $40 million, equivalent to over $1 billion, today, and deployed thousands of troops in what amounted to jungle warfare in the Florida Everglades. But here's where the story gets deliberately confusing in official records. The U.S. government has been extremely selective about which conflicts it officially recognizes as wars versus campaigns, expeditions, or police actions. This isn't accidental terminology. It's a systematic effort to minimize the appearance of organized military resistance by Native American nations. This is where the real mystery begins. Why does the American education system systematically minimize or ignore the longest conflicts in the nation's history? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about American expansion and the legal foundations of the modern United States. First, let's examine the scope of what's been hidden. The Colorado War of 1863 to 1865 included the Sand Creek Massacre, where Colonel John Chivington's forces killed between 150 to 500 peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women, children, and elderly. Chivington himself said, "Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice." This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of official military policy. The Red Cloud's War from 1866 to 1868 was one of the few conflicts where Native Americans achieved complete military victory. The Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho successfully forced the U.S. Army to abandon forts along the Bozeman Trail and agree to the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Yet, most Americans have never heard of Red Cloud, one of the most successful military strategists in American history. The Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877 included the famous Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer's 7th Cavalry was completely destroyed. But what's rarely taught is that this was part of a systematic campaign to force Native Americans onto reservations by destroying their food sources and burning their villages during winter months. The Nez Perce War of 1877 saw Chief Joseph lead a fighting retreat of 1,170 miles while being pursued by multiple U.S. Army columns. This wasn't a primitive fighting force. The Nez Perce used sophisticated military tactics and nearly reached safety in Canada before being forced to surrender. But perhaps most shocking is how recent these conflicts were. The Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 is often presented as the end of Indian resistance. But the Apache Wars continued until Geronimo's final surrender in 1886, and even then, Apache resistance continued sporadically into the 1900s. The last official engagement was the Battle of Bear Valley in 1918, and the final Yaqui conflicts in Arizona weren't resolved until 1924. That means the American Indian Wars were still active when World War I ended. So why the systematic cover-up? Why are these conflicts minimized, renamed, or ignored entirely in mainstream American education? The deliberate historical erasure serves multiple purposes, and understanding these motivations reveals how history is weaponized to support national narratives. Let's examine the different theories that explain this systematic historical revisionism. Theory 1. Legal justification for land acquisition. If Native American resistance is portrayed as savage attacks rather than legitimate warfare by sovereign nations, it becomes easier to justify the seizure of tribal lands. Recognizing these as formal wars between nations would imply that Native Americans had legitimate sovereign rights that were violated through military conquest. The legal implications are still relevant today. Native American tribes continue to assert sovereignty rights and land claims based on treaty violations. If the American public understood that these treaties were broken through systematic military campaigns that constituted formal wars, it would strengthen legal arguments for land restitution and reparations. Theory 2. National mythology and manifest destiny. American national identity is built around concepts like westward expansion and taming the wilderness, acknowledging that this expansion required centuries of warfare against established nations contradicts the mythology of peaceful settlement and empty land waiting to be claimed. The doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief that American expansion across the continent was justified and inevitable, becomes harder to support if the American public understands that expansion required systematic military campaigns against people who had lived on these lands for thousands of years. Theory 3. Moral legitimacy of American government. The Declaration of Independence and Constitution are presented as documents establishing a moral nation based on principles of freedom and justice. If Americans understood that the same government simultaneously conducted genocidal military campaigns, it would complicate this moral narrative. Educational institutions, particularly public schools, serve partly to create patriotic citizens who support their government. Teaching the full scope of American Indian Wars would require discussing government-sponsored genocide, broken treaties, and military tactics that violated even the limited international laws of that era. The evidence for deliberate historical manipulation is overwhelming. Government documents from the era clearly show that officials understood they were conducting systematic military campaigns. General William Tecumseh Sherman wrote, "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children." Coordinated strategies and specific objectives to destroy Native American resistance. Yet these same operations are described in modern textbooks as Indian troubles or frontier conflicts. But there's also evidence of resistance to this narrative manipulation. Some military historians have documented the full scope of these conflicts, and Native American oral histories have preserved detailed accounts of battles and military strategies that don't appear in official records. Recently, declassified military documents reveal the extent of systematic planning that went into campaigns against Native American nations. These weren't spontaneous conflicts. They were carefully planned military operations with specific strategic objectives. However, defenders of current educational approaches argue that including detailed accounts of these conflicts would be too disturbing for young students and might create anti-American sentiment. They claim that the general outline of westward expansion includes implicit acknowledgement of conflicts with Native Americans, but critics respond that sanitizing this history prevents Americans from understanding how their nation was actually built and makes it impossible to address ongoing injustices faced by Native American communities today. The legacy of the American Indian Wars extends far beyond historical curiosity. These conflicts established legal precedents, created the reservation system, and shaped federal policies toward Native Americans that continue today. Understanding this history is crucial for comprehending modern issues like tribal sovereignty, casino rights, sacred site protection, and ongoing legal battles over treaty violations. Without understanding how these treaties were made and broken through military force, current political discussions about Native American rights become incomprehensible. The systematic erasure of this history also reveals how educational institutions can be used to shape national identity and political consciousness. If the longest wars in American history can be minimized or ignored, what other historical truths might be systematically hidden from public knowledge? Most importantly, recognizing these conflicts as the wars they actually were would require acknowledging that Native American nations were exactly that, nations with legitimate sovereignty that resisted foreign invasion through military means. This acknowledgement would have profound implications for how Americans understand their country's origins and ongoing responsibilities. The question we must confront is this: can a democracy built on historical lies about its own origins maintain legitimacy? And what does it mean for American identity if the foundational narrative of peaceful westward expansion is revealed to be a carefully constructed myth designed to hide centuries of systematic military conquest? Do you think American schools should teach the full history of the American Indian Wars, even if it challenges comfortable national narratives? Or do you believe that national education should focus on inspiring patriotism rather than potentially disturbing historical details? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This brings us to the end of today's investigation into America's forgotten wars. The patterns of historical manipulation and narrative control that we've explored today continue to shape how Americans understand their past and present. Recognizing these patterns is crucial for developing critical thinking about official histories and government narratives. If you found this video eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more hidden truths from history. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the stories that challenge official narratives. Until next time, keep questioning what you've been taught and always seek the complete truth.